Japan's sanctions lead to sharp decline in China's exports. China Railway and China Construction file for bankruptcy with the government. Financial firms struggling to survive. China's economy ultimately can't hold on. According to Professor Takahashi Yoichi, the recent sanctions imposed by Japan have severely impacted China's export sector, leading to a sharp decline in trade between the two nations. This move by Japan comes in response to rising geopolitical tensions and the need to safeguard its own economic interests. Japan, which once was a major trading partner with China, has now taken steps to limit imports of certain critical goods, especially in the high-tech sector. As a result, the once thriving trade in electronics, automobiles, and other key industries has been greatly disrupted. China's exports to Japan, which had already been struggling due to the global slowdown, have now been dealt a severe blow. In recent months, exports have dropped by more than 20% in key categories. This decline is particularly noticeable in sectors like electronics, where China's dominance had been nearly unchallenged for years. Takahashi explains that this is not just about trade barriers, but also about Japan's strategic decision to reduce its reliance on Chinese supply chains. With the global economy shifting, Japan has sought to diversify its import sources, focusing on more stable and reliable trade partners, especially in the ASEAN region. What makes this situation particularly concerning for China is the broader economic implications of losing a major export market like Japan. Not only is China facing reduced demand from Japan, but the ripple effects are being felt across multiple sectors. The electronics industry, for example, relies heavily on the export of components to Japan. With fewer orders, Chinese manufacturers are facing production slowdowns, factory closures, and job losses. This is further compounded by Japan's recent push to develop its own semiconductor production capabilities, which threatens to further marginalize China's position in the global supply chain. Being pointed out that while Japan's sanctions may seem targeted and limited in scope, their effect is far-reaching. The sanctions have created uncertainty in the market, causing many companies to pull back from investing in Chinese manufacturing. This loss of investor confidence has been particularly damaging, as many businesses now see China as a less stable partner. Furthermore, Japanese companies that previously operated in China are relocating their operations to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, where labor is cheaper and political risks are perceived to be lower. In his analysis, Takahashi underscores the fact that Japan's approach is not unique. Other nations, including South Korea and the United States, have also started re-evaluating their trade relationships with China. Japan, however, has been particularly effective in leveraging economic sanctions as a tool of both economic and geopolitical strategy. By tightening restrictions on imports from China, Japan not only protects its own industries but also aligns itself more closely with its Western allies, especially the U.S. In curbing China's economic rise, the repercussions for China are clear. With its export-driven economy already facing headwinds from a global slowdown, these sanctions have further eroded one of its key economic pillars. As factories slow production and layoffs increase, the broader economic consequences are being felt throughout Chinese society. Consumers are spending less, local governments are grappling with decreased tax revenues, and the national GDP growth has slowed to its lowest rate in decades. Takahashi warns that unless China finds a way to counteract these trends, perhaps by opening up new markets or advancing domestic consumption, it will face a prolonged economic downturn. In Takashi's analysis of the Chinese economy, highlights the alarming situation involving two of China's largest state-owned enterprises, China Railway and China Construction. Both companies, once symbols of China's booming infrastructure growth, are now facing insurmountable financial difficulties, leading them to file for bankruptcy with the Chinese government. This shocking development underscores the extent to which China's economic model, built on rapid urbanization and infrastructure expansion, is now unraveling under the weight of debt and mismanagement. According to Takahashi, the roots of this crisis lie in China's aggressive infrastructure strategy, where massive investments were made in railways, highways, and real estate projects to stimulate economic growth. However, the returns on these investments have not materialized as expected. Over time, the demand for new infrastructure projects has dwindled, leaving China Railway and China Construction with unfinished projects and billions of yuan in outstanding debt. The ongoing property market collapse, which has hit cities like Shenzhen and Beijing particularly hard, has further exacerbated the situation. As housing demand plummeted, so too did the need for construction projects, leaving these companies without the revenue to service their debts. China Railway, responsible for the development of the country's extensive high-speed rail network, has been particularly hard hit. Despite its role in transforming China's transportation infrastructure, the company has accumulated enormous debt. The high costs of maintaining and expanding rail networks, combined with falling passenger numbers due to economic slowdown and pandemic disruptions, have put immense pressure on its financial resources. Takahashi explains that China Railway's attempt to secure government bailouts to stay afloat has only delayed the inevitable, as the Chinese government itself is grappling with a fiscal crisis, making it less capable of providing the necessary support. China Construction, similarly, finds itself in a precarious position. As one of the country's largest construction firms, it has been deeply involved in China's urbanization push, building residential and commercial developments across the nation. However, as the real estate bubble bursts, China Construction has found itself stuck with a vast inventory of unsold properties. Many of these developments were funded by debt, and as property values plummet, the company is left holding massive liabilities without the cash flow needed to service them. Takahashi points out that the collapse of China's housing market has had a cascading effect on companies like China Construction, which had relied on the assumption of endless demand for housing and urban expansion. The decision of these two giants to file for bankruptcy is a major blow to the Chinese economy. These companies are not only employers of millions but also integral parts of China's economic growth strategy. Their collapse signals the broader weaknesses in the Chinese economic model, where over-reliance on state-owned enterprises and debt-driven growth has created significant systemic risks. Takahashi emphasizes that the downfall of China Railway and China Construction is emblematic of a deeper structural problem: China's inability to shift away from its investment-heavy growth strategy, despite clear signs that this model is no longer sustainable. This situation also raises important questions about the role of the Chinese government in managing the economy. Beijing has traditionally relied on its control over state-owned enterprises to steer the economy through difficult times. However, with both China Railway and China Construction now on the brink of collapse, the government's ability to manage this crisis is being severely tested. Takahashi argues that the Chinese leadership is now facing a dilemma: either bail out these failing giants at enormous public expense or allow them to collapse, risking widespread economic and social instability. The implications of these bankruptcies extend beyond China's borders. As major players in global infrastructure development, both companies have been involved in projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Their financial difficulties threaten to derail these international projects, further damaging China's reputation as a global economic leader. Takahashi notes that this could have far-reaching consequences for China's soft power and influence, as partner countries may begin to question China's reliability as an economic partner. Takahashi Yoichi has drawn attention to the dire state of China's financial firms, which, like many other sectors in the country, are grappling with unprecedented pressures. The financial industry in China, once seen as a cornerstone of the nation's economic success, is now struggling under the weight of mounting debt, government intervention, and a slowing economy. As Takahashi explains, these firms are now suffocating, unable to cope with the complex web of financial obligations and shrinking profits. The roots of the current financial crisis stem from years of over-leveraging and excessive lending practices. In a bid to stimulate economic growth, Chinese financial firms were encouraged to extend credit to both individuals and businesses on a massive scale. However, with the collapse of key sectors such as real estate and infrastructure, many of these loans have now turned into non-performing assets. Takahashi points out that the real estate sector alone has contributed heavily to the financial woes of these firms. As property values plummet and construction projects halt, the loans tied to these developments are defaulting at an alarming rate. This, in turn, has placed immense strain on the balance sheets of banks and other financial institutions, leading to widespread fears of insolvency. Compounding the problem is the Chinese government's response to the crisis. In an attempt to stabilize the financial system, Beijing has imposed strict controls on lending and increased oversight of the financial sector. While these measures were intended to prevent further financial mismanagement, they have had the unintended effect of stifling growth. Financial firms now find themselves caught in a difficult position, unable to lend freely due to government restrictions, yet still burdened by their existing debt obligations. As Takahashi describes, the situation has become a vicious cycle. Financial firms need liquidity to stay afloat, but the very mechanisms designed to safeguard the system are preventing them from accessing the funds they desperately need. In addition to these structural issues, the human cost of this financial crisis is becoming increasingly apparent. Takahashi notes that many employees within China's financial sector have seen their salaries slashed and their job security threatened. In a bid to cut costs, firms have been forced to reduce wages, eliminate bonuses, and lay off staff. This has led to a significant drop in morale within the industry, further exacerbating the inefficiencies and problems these companies are facing. The once prestigious jobs in finance, which were highly sought after by young professionals, are now seen as unstable and fraught with uncertainty. Takahashi emphasizes that the problems facing China's financial firms are not limited to the domestic market. Many of these companies have significant exposure to international markets, particularly through investments in infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. As the financial situation worsens, these firms are finding it increasingly difficult to meet their obligations abroad. This has led to a loss of confidence from international investors, who are now reconsidering their involvement with Chinese financial institutions. The withdrawal of foreign capital is further deepening the crisis, as Chinese firms struggle to secure the funding needed to sustain their operations. What makes the situation even more precarious is the interconnected nature of China's financial system. Takahashi explains that many financial firms are tied to state-owned enterprises SOEs, which are themselves facing significant financial difficulties. The collapse of major SOEs such as China Railway and China Construction has only added to the pressure on financial firms, as these institutions had extended substantial loans to these companies. With the SOEs unable to repay their debts, the financial sector is left to absorb the losses, which are proving to be too much for many firms to handle. In comprehensive analysis of the Chinese economy, he illustrates a grim reality: China's economic structure, which once seemed unstoppable, is now on the verge of collapse. The once celebrated economic miracle of rapid industrialization, infrastructure development, and export-led growth has started to crumble under its own weight. For years, China's growth model was built on debt-driven investments and massive state intervention. However, the very foundation of this model has begun to erode, and it is now evident that China's economy can no longer sustain itself under these immense pressures. Takahashi argues that the recent collapses of major industries, particularly in real estate, infrastructure, and finance, are clear symptoms of the deeper systemic issues plaguing China. Companies like China Railway and China Construction filing for bankruptcy, along with the suffocating financial sector, have dealt a significant blow to the overall economy. The interconnectedness of these sectors, where the collapse of one leads to the failure of others, has created a domino effect, pushing the economy closer to the edge. As Takahashi points out, these are not isolated incidents but rather reflective of a broader structural breakdown in China's economic machinery. Adding to these internal struggles, external pressures such as Japan's sanctions and the global slowdown in trade have intensified the economic turmoil. With a sharp decline in exports to key markets like Japan, China's export-dependent economy is feeling the strain more than ever. Takahashi highlights that China's traditional export-led growth strategy is no longer viable in a world that is increasingly skeptical of its economic practices. Countries are turning away from Chinese imports, opting to diversify their supply chains in response to geopolitical tensions and trade wars. This shift has left China with excess production capacity and reduced revenue, further compounding its economic woes. Internally, the property market crash has had devastating consequences. The collapse of major real estate developers, alongside shrinking demand for housing, has rippled across the economy. Local governments, which have relied heavily on land sales to developers for revenue, are now facing significant budget shortfalls. As Takahashi explains, this has created a vicious cycle. Local governments can no longer fund public services and infrastructure projects, leading to reduced economic activity, further weakening the economy. Takahashi also draws attention to the rising public dissatisfaction in China. As economic growth stalls, unemployment rates have surged, particularly among the younger population. Graduates who once flocked to jobs in finance, construction, and technology are now finding themselves without employment. This growing discontent is a stark reminder that China's social stability has long been tied to its economic prosperity. With that prosperity now in jeopardy, the Chinese government faces the daunting task of maintaining social order while grappling with economic decay. Furthermore, Takahashi notes the limitations of the Chinese government's response to this crisis. The government's efforts to stimulate the economy through targeted fiscal measures and increased debt have proven ineffective. Rather than spurring growth, these interventions have only delayed the inevitable, as the underlying problems remain unaddressed. By relying on short-term fixes, such as injecting liquidity into the financial system and rolling out modest infrastructure projects, China has failed to implement the structural reforms needed to ensure long-term stability. Takahashi believes that without significant changes to its economic model, China is heading toward a prolonged period of stagnation or even recession. The consequences of China's economic failure extend beyond its borders. As the world's second-largest economy, a collapse in China would send shockwaves through global markets. Many countries, particularly those in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which have become heavily reliant on Chinese investments and trade, would find themselves grappling with their own economic crises. Moreover, global supply chains, which are deeply intertwined with China, would experience severe disruptions, affecting industries from electronics to automotive manufacturing. In his final assessment, Professor Takahashi does not offer much optimism for China's immediate future. The cracks in China's economic framework have widened to the point where superficial repairs are no longer enough. The collapse of major sectors, coupled with an increasingly isolated position in global trade, has left China vulnerable to a broader economic downfall. What was once the world's fastest-growing economy is now at risk of becoming a cautionary tale of unchecked debt, over-reliance on state intervention, and the dangers of neglecting fundamental economic reforms.